Otis Redding was gone way before his time, passing away in a plane crash in 1967. Despite the fact that he looked older, Redding was only 26 years old, arguably the face of soul music. Though his impact on music is indelible, nearly 60 years after his death, Otis released albums in his lifetime for only 4 years, from 1964 to 1967. The fact that he's had such a lasting impact, in spite of having had such a short career, further speaks to his greatness. Otis Ray Redding Jr. was born September 9th, 1941, to Otis Sr. and Fanny Redding. Otis Sr. was a fanatically religious man and the grandson of a slave. He also was a Baptist preacher. When Otis was only 3, he was already singing in church, accompanied by his father on the pipe organ. Otis Sr. would serve as a strict example to young Otis as he grew up. Many black laborers, like Otis Sr., look forward to Friday nights, as that's when they get to blow off steam, hang out, and listen to music while enjoying a drink or two. However, the elder Redding did no such thing. He felt that the type of music they played in those places was the devil's music. Meanwhile, to his dismay, young Otis was spending every penny he had on R&B records. Even though Otis Sr. didn't like secular music, he didn't ban it from the house. Instead, he'd often lecture young Otis about the devil and his devilish ways. To try and distract the 10-year-old's mind from that evil music, Dad would take him horseback riding, fishing, and hunting. As Otis grew older and reached high school, he began singing outside of church, and he often won talent shows and soon began performing in local clubs. When Otis was 15, he went to a dive bar in Macon called the Hillview Springs Social Club. There, he met a woman named Gladys Williams, who was a blues singer in the Big Mama Thornton style. Gladys had a string of protégés who, coincidentally, were handsome young men that she promised to use her influence to further their career. Word on the street was that Gladys did more with her protégés than just listening to them sing. But check it out. Otis was aware of this, and he was willing to do whatever he had to do to get on. Accordingly, Gladys took Otis under her wing, among other things, tutoring him on the nuances of singing, among other things. She also had him enter a local talent show hosted by Hamp King D. Swain. The contest winner walked away with a $15 prize, y'all. Not only did Otis win the contest on his very first try, Otis won it for the following 15 weeks in a row. By that time, everybody was sick of Otis. So after number 15, they barred him from entering the contest anymore because other people want a chance to win too. Meanwhile, at that point in his life, Otis already believed that he could make a living as a singer. As a result, he began calling his singing his career. When his father heard this, he was not pleased. He called Otis' singing screaming and teenage foolishness. And he went on to tell Otis that he wasn't going to amount to anything with the singing and hanging out in nightclubs. In 1958, Otis's reasons for singing would change due to circumstances. At that point, Otis had to start singing for the sake of his family. Otis Sr. contracted tuberculosis and was hospitalized. Fanny's income as a maid wasn't enough to pay that $50 a month mortgage, and it certainly wasn't enough to put food on the table either. As a result, Otis had to earn money to help out, and he dropped out of high school. He also started taking jobs wherever he could get them, doing construction work, working in an oil rig, doing some roofing, and serving as a delivery boy for a grocery store. Mostly, Otis was keeping the family afloat by earning money doing what his father didn't want him to do, singing. Meanwhile, Otis's performances at those talent shows caught the eye of another entertainer. Johnny Jenkins was a guitar player whose style was very similar to Little Richard's. He had his own band, Patty Cake and the Mighty Panthers, and he was a showman on stage. Jenkins used to excite the crowd with full splits, playing the guitar while he was on his knees, and duck strutting like Chuck Berry. Jenkins asked Otis if he wanted to join his band, and Otis said, yeah, and so he joined. While Jenkins was the star of the band, people started coming out to hear Otis. As a result, instead of promoters touting an appearance from Patty Cake, they instead hyped up Rockin' Otis Redding, or Otis Rockin' Robin Redding. Eventually, Jenkins left Patty Cake and formed a new band, the Pine Toppers. Redding also left Patty Cake to join the Pine Toppers. Additionally, Jenkins now had a manager, a college kid named Phil Walden. Walden already knew who Otis was, and he was impressed with his talent. Later, Walden would serve as Otis's manager. Meanwhile, Otis met a girl named Zelma Atwood at one of his shows. When he saw her while he was performing, he made a mental note to find her afterwards. Once he did, he hit her with the line, "How's it going, baby?" Zelma responded, "I ain't your baby." Getting past this, though, they kept talking and began dating. While Otis could have had any girl he wanted, he was drawn to Zelma's tendency to shoot it straight and to keep him grounded. In 1960, becoming bored with Macon and in the middle of escalating tension with his father again, Otis decided to take a road trip with his sister Deborah to Los Angeles. He was hopeful of making some moves with his music while he was there and to begin making some real money. Prior to leaving Georgia, he got some unexpected news from Zelma. She was pregnant. Though Zelma didn't believe him when he said it, Otis promised that he'd be back in Macon in time for their baby's birth. Shortly after Thanksgiving, Redding and his sister headed to Los Angeles. After he got there, he wasted no time meeting people in the music community. One man he met was a freelance producer named James McEachin, who was working under the name Jimmy Mack. Years later, McEachin would become a character actor known for appearances on TV and in movies such as Play Misty for Me. Redding moved in with McEachin and his wife and began to prepare for a recording session. One of the goals of the session was to try and have Otis sound as much like Jackie Wilson as possible because that was Otis's favorite singer. Otis recorded 4 songs that day: She's Alright, Tough Enough, Gamma Llama, and Getting Hip. At one point, McEachin asked Otis for a couple of songs that he'd written. Otis suggested These Arms of Mine. However, McEachin didn't think much of that song, and he moved on to something else. Of the songs that Otis recorded, McEachin took She's Alright to a radio station in Oxnard, California. McEachin reflected that the DJ played that song about 20 times that same night. However, without a label, McEachin didn't have the money it took to distribute the song. A little later, McEachin hooked up with a Denver, Colorado-based label, Trans World. However, when McEachin played the song for one of the partners, Maury Bernstein, there was only one problem. While Bernstein liked the song, he couldn't understand a word that Otis was saying on it. As far as Otis was concerned, he felt like he hadn't really found any success in Los Angeles as far as his music went. So after 8 months, he was ready to go back home. And he'd get there just in time, as promised, for the birth of his baby. Once he was back in Macon, he picked up where he left off, rejoining the Pine Toppers and performing in clubs. Meanwhile, Otis's father was doubly heated. Not only was the boy singing the devil's music, he'd had premarital sex too. Lord! Trying to make good, Otis promised to marry Zelma before the baby was born. And so it was. On August 17, 1961, Zelma Atwood became Zelma Redding. Days later, their son, Dexter, was born. The new family moved in with Zelma's grandmother. Otis barely saw his wife or his son, as he often slept till noon following his all-night gigs. Additionally, Otis often had to pick up other jobs to supplement his club income. Trying to make things happen on his own, Otis went to the office of a local record label, Confederate Records. It was owned by a man named Bobby Smith, who was a former car salesman. After having nearly lost his life in a car accident a few years earlier, Smith emerged from the crash with only one eye, which he now struggled to see with. When Redding approached Smith about signing him, Otis sang Shout Bama Lama, which was a revised version of the song we mentioned earlier, Gamma Lama. Smith signed Redding on the spot and immediately set up a recording session to cut the song. In the fall of 1962, Shout Bama Lama, back with Fat Gal, was released, credited to Otis Redding and the Pine Toppers. Released on Smith's Confederate label, the racist connotations of the Confederate flag label became a problem. While Smith and Redding were on the road trying to promote the single, some radio stations said that they would play it. However, they would only do so if the song was taken off of the Confederate label. To that end, being more of a businessman and less of a racist, Smith went home and created the Orbit record label, then put the song Shout Bama Lama on that label. Meanwhile, Zelma was pregnant again, meaning that Otis definitely needed more money now. On nights when he wasn't performing, Otis worked as a parking lot attendant and a hospital orderly. While his career stalled, his friend Johnny Jenkins was doing fine. Jenkins was able to buy himself a red Chevrolet, despite not even knowing how to drive. As a result, Otis began serving as Jenkins' driver. Redding's new role as a chauffeur would lead to an event that would change his life forever. In February of 1962, Jenkins had an audition at Stax Records. Otis, serving as his driver, went along with him. Unbeknownst to Redding, this played perfectly into the hands of a man named Joey Galkin. Secretly, after pretending that he thought Otis quote-unquote stunk as a singer, Galkin wanted to sign Otis to Atlantic Records. In fact, Galkin had gotten $2,000 from Atlantic Records to pay for 3 hours of studio time at Stax Records. Galkin believed that would be plenty of time for both Jenkins and Redding to record. Finally, at the audition, since Phil Walden wouldn't be present, Galkin was angling to present himself as Otis's only manager. Redding's boss at Confederate Records, Bobby Smith, unwittingly was saying goodbye to his biggest artist simply because he was being a nice guy. Smith loaned Otis the car that he used in order to drive up to Stax. Once Redding and Jenkins arrived in Memphis at the recording studio, any onlooker would have assumed that Otis was the hired help. Otis jumped out of the driver's seat, went to the trunk, got all the music equipment, and carried it all into the studio by himself. He then stood by and watched as the musicians got ready for the session. As the session went on, Otis began to get fidgety. Walden, unaware of what Galkin was up to, had told Otis to try and get some time to record during the session. As a result, Otis began asking musician Al Jackson about getting a shot to sing between takes. Finally, with less than 30 minutes left in the session, Otis got his chance. If for no other reason than to shut Otis up, Jackson said, quote, "Hey, there's a guy here with Johnny, and he's been after me all day long about wanting to hear him sing. Could you take 5 minutes to listen to this guy sing?" Unquote. Stax owner Jim Stewart was ready to let his musicians go home. However, Galkin, sitting with Stewart, interjected, quote, Wait, we got time for another kid, unquote. Galkin then lied, saying that Atlantic would only pay if both guys, meaning Johnny and Otis, got to sing. Stewart believed the lie, and he allowed Otis to record. The song Otis chose was Hey Hey Baby, which was a song in the style of Little Richard. After hearing it, Stewart wasn't impressed, and he even said, quote, "The world's not looking for another Little Richard," unquote. However, he did like Otis's voice, and he wanted to hear more. "You got another one?" Stewart asked Otis. This time, Redding sang These Arms of Mine, which blew Stewart away. He was so excited that he immediately wanted to record the song. Afterwards, both Otis and Johnny would leave Memphis as the newest artist signed to the Stax label. Otis's contract was for 3 years. Otis would be paid the staggering sum of the standard 3.5 cents per record sold. Wow. Now in the military, after hearing about all that was going on around Otis, and now that he actually had a major label recording contract, Walden took leave from the military. He came home, and he signed Otis to a 3-year personal management contract. Meanwhile, Walden and Galkin, with no input whatsoever from Otis, agreed on a 50-50 split of the 50% publishing royalties on all current and future Otis Redding records. Jim Stewart and Stax on the other 50%. Guess how much that left for Otis Redding? For his own work, this left a grand total of 0% for Otis. Additionally, Galkin would also receive 30% of Otis's record sales in perpetuity. Another entity, Bobby Smith, the dude from Confederate Records, believed that he still had the rights to all of Otis's music. Smith hired a lawyer, but after he did so, the lawyer advised him to settle the case, which he did for the grand total of $700. At the time, though, Smith was convinced that he was only signing over the rights to the song These Arms of Mine, and that not only was Otis still on Orbit Records, Smith was still serving as his manager. However, the fine print, which trips up everybody, told a different story. Smith had unknowingly signed away all his rights to anything that had anything to do with Otis Redding. These Arms of Mine was released in October of 1962. However, initially the song didn't do much. While all this was going on, even as early as 1963, there was no immediate change in Otis's life. He was still living in Macon, and he was still performing at local clubs. However, These Arms of Mine started to move, and then eventually the song went number 20 R&B, and it sold 800,000 copies. Another Otis song, What My Heart Needs, went number 27 R&B, while still another, Pain in My Heart, went number 11 R&B. However, there was a legal problem with the song Pain in My Heart. While Otis and his manager Phil Walden claimed that they co-wrote it, the song was suspiciously similar to a song called Ruler of My Heart, which had been released by Irma Thomas earlier in 1963. That version was written by Alan Toussaint using the pseudonym Naomi Neville. While some of the lyrics were different, some of the lyrics were exactly the same, not even trying. When the producer of the song had his lawyers contact Stax, Stewart agreed to change the credits. In March of 1964, Otis's debut album, titled Pain in My Heart, was released. The album went number 20 R&B, but only number 103 pop. In December of 1964, Otis was back in the studio, cutting That's How Strong My Love Is and Mr. Pitiful. Mr. Pitiful was a song co-written by Redding and Steve Cropper, and the title was a nod to the nickname that had been given to Otis by Moore Williams, who was a DJ in Memphis. Williams had called Redding that because of how emotional and sad Otis often sounded on his ballads. Meanwhile, Otis and Zelma had began getting into arguments about how much time Otis was spending on the road. In one particular instant, Otis was performing in Detroit, and while he was in the dressing room, he was talking to another Otis, Otis Williams, a member of the Temptations. Williams found out that in the middle of his show, Redding had come off stage to call his wife on the phone, and she'd hung up on him. Angry over what had happened, Redding told him that he was going to fly back to Macon and have that conversation in person, y'all. Whatever else happened, though, apparently the two kissed and made up, because about 9 months later, there was yet another addition to the Redding family, as their third child, Otis III, was born. Meanwhile, Otis's next album, The Great Otis Redding Sings Soul Ballads, was released in March of 1965. The album went number 3 R&B, and 4 songs were released as singles: Chained and Bound, Come to Me, Mr. Pitiful, and That's How Strong My Love Is. Right behind that, the single I've Been Loving You Too Long, Stop Now, was released in April of 1965. The song was a big hit, going number 2 R&B and number 21 pop. We're going to take a time out from our story to ask you to like, subscribe, share, comment, hit that notification bell, and repeat when it comes to our videos. Now, back to our story. For his next album, Otis was looking for songs that would help him hit it big on the pop charts. With that in mind, he chose to cover the Temptations' hit My Girl, which they'd written to #1 on the pop charts. There was also another song he would cover that was a surprise to many people, the Rolling Stones' #1 hit Satisfaction. Otis had never even heard of the song when Booker T of Booker T and the MGs and Steve Cropper approached him about singing it. However, they convinced him to cover it, and cover it he did, as only Otis Redding could. He started changing the lyrics in the first verse, and then just kinda did Otis for the rest of the song. Otis would later say, quote, "I used a lot of words different than the Stones' version. That's because I made them up," unquote. The album containing these songs was titled Otis Blue. Otis Redding sings soul. The song Respect went #4 R&B, and the album, released a month later, went #1 R&B. It went on to become the biggest selling album of Otis's lifetime. Meanwhile, fresh from returning from his tour in the Army, Phil Walden went to work for his #1 client, meaning Redding. Phil Walden went to work for his #1 client, meaning Redding. He began having Otis wear clothes from only the top stores, wearing Italian sweaters and Ole Cassini suits with silk ties too. He also got Otis his own record label, which allowed Redding to scout and record talent of his choosing. Additionally, Walden set up a publishing company so that Otis could own and control the rights to his songs. Of course, Walden named himself co-owner and administrator of the company. The publishing company was called Redwall, which was a combination of Otis's and Phil's last names. Each man was a 25% partner in the business. Jim Stewart, owner of Stax Records, also owned 25%. Finally, Joe Galkin, the man who initially angled to get Redding his audition at Stax, owned the final 25%. Otis's musical success allowed him to buy anything he wanted. To that end, he bought himself a purple Cadillac, y'all. He even bought his wife a champagne-colored Ford Fairlane, even though she didn't even know how to drive. Those weren't the only cars he had, though. Otis had a driveway full of the latest automobiles. Sometimes he'd get bored with a car after he'd driven it only once or twice, and when that happened, he'd give the now old car away as a gift. Sometimes he gave it to friends, but occasionally he also gave these cars to perfect strangers. Otis also purchased a 300-acre ranch that he named the Big O Ranch. He built homes for himself and his family, while also building one for his parents and his brother Rogers on the same acreage. In his free time, Otis enjoyed riding one of his many horses, and he also enjoyed farming, plowing his own fields, and tending to pigs, cows, and chickens. Otis liked to ride his tractor too, and repairing it as was needed. Getting back to Otis and his music, he was in the studio working on his next album. The album, complete and unbelievable, The Otis Redding Dictionary of Soul, was released in October of 1966. The album went #5 R&B and included one of his signature songs, Try a Little Tenderness. The song had been covered numerous times, and no less than Frank Sinatra, Aretha Franklin, and Sam Cooke had done so. However, no one had ever done it like Otis. Starting slow and ending with Otis in full frenzy, some believe this to be the best song that Redding ever recorded. The rule of thumb for anyone wanting him to do a show meant that they had to adhere to the Redding rule. Otis always had to be top billed, and he also had to be the closer. Even someone as established and famous as Ray Charles was told that he had to go on before Otis or lose the gig entirely. In full disclosure of that situation, Brother Ray was coming off, to put it mildly, a bad year. He'd been arrested for the 3rd time for railroad possession. As a result, he'd been put on probation for 5 years, fined $10,000, and forced to take a year off from recording and music in order to go into rehab. So he desperately needed this gig. Otis also began being hard on the local musicians that he hired at some of his gigs. Often these guys only played a gig or two, and then they were let go. As Redding's fame grew, he had less and less tolerance for mistakes. In true James Brown fashion, he began fining guys for mistakes, usually $10 per mistake. While this doesn't sound like much, these musicians weren't making a lot, so it was a big hit for them. While Otis was known publicly as a smiling and good-natured guy, kind of a backwoods type guy, don't let the smooth taste fool you. He carried a .38 tucked in his waistband, and he wasn't afraid to use it. Once, back in 1964, a friend of Otis's, Herbert Ellis, got beat up by a man, David McGee, who'd been flirting with Ellis's girlfriend. When Otis heard about this, he wanted to ride on that fool. Otis got his bodyguard and two of his homeboys and rode to McGee's house. The four men then got out and started firing through the windows of the house. Shots came back their way too, and Otis got hit by some buckshot. Meanwhile, both David McGee and his brother Willie were hit, and they had to go to the hospital. At the same time, Otis and his crew sped off in Otis's caddy. No one was seriously hurt in the exchange, and only Otis's bodyguard was even charged with anything. Otis's clean, good guy image would take yet another hit. Loretta Williams was a vocalist who traveled with Otis and his crew. As she put it, she was, quote, the only girl traveling with about 20 sex-starved, pot-smoking, drunken, and sometimes just downright crazy men. When it came to Otis, Williams spoke about seeing Redding lose his temper, specifically when musicians asked him for more money. Once, a sax player named Skag, who was both drunk and high, demanded that Otis pay him more money. Redding then cursed the guy out and told him that he, nor any of the other band members, was getting no more money. After Skag threatened to kick Otis in his hind parts if he didn't pay up, Redding beat the dude down. Not only did he kick Skag in his hind parts, he kicked other parts of Skag too. Loretta thought that Otis was cruel for beating up a man who was inebriated. On another note, she said that band members often skipped out on paying their hotel bills because Otis didn't pay them on time. Williams was signed to Otis's Jodis record label and had the same manager as Redding, Phil Walden. However, when her single was released, she alleges that she wasn't paid anything. Instead, all of the royalties went to both Redding and Phil Walden. Loretta thought that Otis was a thug and that he abused women in the way that he treated them. She alleges that Otis would openly talk about the women that he'd slept with. He not only dogged them out by talking about them, he dogged them out in person as well. According to Williams, Otis would brag about kicking girls out with no clothes on after he'd had his way with them. She says that he wanted to shame the women and have all his people in his group laugh at them. Williams also alleges that Otis tried to get her to hook up with him, but she told Otis no. She also says that when she hooked up instead with Otis's road manager, Speedo Sims, Otis got mad. Allegedly, according to her, Otis said, quote, "You mean you would rather be with this guy who don't have nothing to give you, and you wouldn't give me none?" Unquote. Things came to a head between Loretta and Otis during one particular tour stop when she got sick. Otis told her sick or no, she better sing or she wasn't getting paid. Williams then told Otis that she didn't have to stay with his group and be treated this way. Finally, according to Loretta, Otis told Speedo Sims, quote, "Give the bitch her money and send her home," unquote. That was the end of her time with Otis, as well as with Jodis Records. Williams says that she never received any royalties from any of her songs. Regarding Loretta's comments about Otis's behavior towards her and with other women, no one has corroborated her stories. Meanwhile, Otis was in the process of hyping up his protege, Arthur Conley. Indeed, on a 6-week tour of England that took place in 1967, Otis insisted that Conley be billed above established stars Sam and Dave, as well as Booker T and the MGs. Otis also began spreading his wings outside of his own performances. Arthur Conley's single, Sweet Soul Music, which was co-written and produced by Redding, went number 2 on both the R&B and pop charts. Additionally, Otis produced Conley's entire debut album. In June of 1967, the Monterey Pop Festival was scheduled to be held in California. The festival was patterned after the Monterey Jazz Festival, which was held to raise money for music education. As a result, acts that performed agreed to do so for free. The same setup was scheduled for the pop festival. Otis was invited to perform, but he wasn't really feeling it when he found out that he wouldn't be getting paid for the gig. In fact, initially he didn't want to do it. However, when Bill Graham, a concert promoter, approached Otis about attending, he agreed to do it. Though the festival attendees were overwhelmingly rock fans, folk music fans, and hippies, Otis was scheduled to close the second night of the three-night event. While many of the fans may not even known who Otis was prior to the festival, his fellow performers, such as Janis Joplin, were eager to see him in action. Prior to going on to perform in front of a crowd who was openly blowing trees and dropping acid, Otis indulged in a little Maui Wowie himself in order to relax. When his manager, who'd never seen Otis toke before going on stage before, told him, quote, "Don't smoke that ish now," unquote, Otis told him, quote, "Aw, F, don't worry about it, man," unquote. To make matters worse, Otis hadn't even prepared much for his set. In fact, beyond the song Shake, he had no idea what songs he would even perform. Otis's plan was to just feel what he needed to do once he was on stage. Redding finally hit the stage at 1 a.m. in the morning, and it had just started raining. Despite that, Redding would show them what the fuss around him was all about. In his approximately 30-minute set, Otis had the crowd eating out of his hand. His performance even brought Rolling Stones member Brian Jones to tears. Otis emerged from the pop festival as a conquering hero of sorts. In some people's eyes, he was the #1 act in all of music, regardless of genre. Concluding a California tour that he'd been on after performing at Monterey, Otis had a week-long gig in San Francisco. While he was there, he kept being hounded by female fans at his hotel. In response to that, he moved to Bill Graham's houseboat in Sausalito, California, which was just across the Golden Gate Bridge from San Francisco. Staying in Sausalito gave the exhausted Redding a much-needed respite. Every day he was there, he'd sit on the dock, relaxing and watching ships come and go. While he did so, he began writing lyrics based on what he saw. The dock that the boat was moored to, along with the images of boats as well as the sounds of water, were inspiration for Otis to write his signature song, Sitting on the Dock of the Bay. It was unlike anything that Otis had ever done before. Speedo Sims, his road manager who was with Otis at the boathouse, said he couldn't quite follow it. Otis's wife Zelma says that she really couldn't get into it. In fact, Zelma's opinion of the song caused Otis to leave it alone for a while and left the song unfinished. By the fall of 1967, Otis's rigorous touring, along with his throat, began to betray him. Since Otis sang from his throat and not from his gut, he couldn't hit some of his usual high notes. After he went to see a throat specialist, he was told that he had polyps in his larynx. Surgery was recommended along with a 2-month recuperation period. Though he was afraid that the surgery would alter his voice, Redding had no choice but to comply. After taking the proper time to heal, Otis scheduled a studio session for early December of 1967. After that, he'd already scheduled several tour dates to ramp up towards his usual touring schedule. Aside from the excitement of being able to tour again, Redding was giddy that he'd get to ride in his Beechcraft H-18 private plane. Ominously, when he found out that Redding was using the H-18 plane to tour in, James Brown tried to warn him against doing so. Brown used to have that same plane, but he had gotten rid of it. Brown told him that the plane wasn't big enough to be doing what Otis was trying to do. He went on to tell him that it couldn't carry all those people and all that equipment, and that Otis shouldn't be using that plane, shouldn't be messing around with it at all. Otis's response, quote, "Oh, it's all right, boss man. We've got a few problems, but it's doing okay," he told Brown. Once Otis got in studio, on December the 6th, he recorded enough material that would fill 3 albums that would be released posthumously. However, there was one song that Otis didn't record during that marathon session, Sitting on the Dock of the Bay. After the session, with an overwhelming feeling that he absolutely had to record the song now, Otis scheduled another recording session for December 7th. When recording the song, Steve Cropper later reflected that he knew that Otis liked to ad-lib at the end of his songs. With that in mind, Cropper said that he left room at the end of the song for Otis to do just that. Beforehand, Cropper and Otis had come up with an ad-lib for Redding to do. However, when that part of the song came up, Otis had forgot what the ad-lib was, and as a result, he just started whistling. Al Bell, conversely to what Cropper said, says that Otis always intended for his whistling to be the ending to the song. Indeed, on the 3 takes of the song that Otis recorded that day, he whistled at the end of each one. Whatever the reason was that he decided to whistle, it was the perfect ending to an all-time great song. At the time, though, only Redding thought that the song would be a hit. After he passed away, Steve Cropper became the official protector of the song. Despite Jim Stewart, as well as Atlantic Records, wanting Cropper to add elements to the song that would flesh it out and make it sound more like a hit, Cropper refused to add anything that he didn't think that Redding would want on the song. His one concession was to add the sounds of waves and seagulls as backing noise on the track. After he recorded the song, Otis flew away in his private plane, which was piloted by Richard Fraser. They went on to a couple of tour stops. Meanwhile, Otis's plane had low battery power and had previously had some mechanical problems on earlier flights. Additionally, the weather was bad that day, consisting of rain, dense fog, and thick cloud cover. All commercial flights had been grounded, and it was strongly recommended to Otis's pilot that he not fly either. Despite that, when Otis asked the pilot if he thought he could take off and land the plane safely, Fraser said yes. Otis's response was, "Then let's go." While it's not known exactly what happened to Otis's plane that day, it is known that something made the engine suddenly sputter and quit. Speculation is that Fraser, unable to see through the fog, was flying blind, and the plane wound up hitting the lake. Once it did hit the lake, the plane didn't break apart, but instead sat bobbing on top of the freezing water for a few minutes before it began sinking. Miraculously, Ben Cauley, the Bar-Kays trumpet player, survived the crash. He was thrown from the plane and was using his seat as a flotation device when responders found him. When Otis's body wasn't initially found, his wife Zelma held out hope that somehow he was able to get out of the water, he was still alive, but unfortunately, it wasn't true. Otis's body was found the next day, and he was still strapped in his seat at the time. Otis's funeral was held in Macon, Georgia on December 18, 1967, and it was attended by many stars, including James Brown, Wilson Pickett, Percy Sledge, Johnny Taylor, Joe Tex, Carla and Rufus Thomas, Jackie Wilson, and Stevie Wonder. Presiding over Otis's funeral was the Reverend C.J. Andrews, who was the same man who had married Otis and Zelma. In February of 1968, the posthumous album The Dock of the Bay was released. Spurred by Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, the album went #1 R&B and #4 pop. The single Sitting on the Dock of the Bay was a smash, as it went #1 on both the R&B and pop charts. While no one's death is ever timely, Otis Redding's death was particularly untimely. He was just beginning to hit his stride as a singer, and he already was one of the top acts in the world. He awed audiences with the emotion and passion he was able to pour into his songs, which you could feel when you listened to his albums. Those who got a chance to see him in person were hypnotized by the power of his performances as well as his stage presence. If you asked 100 people who they thought was most symbolic of soul music, it's a safe bet that the majority of those people would answer Otis Redding. What's your favorite song by Otis Redding? What's your favorite album by him? Who do you think is most symbolic of soul music? Let us know what you think in the comments. Thank you all for checking out our video. We appreciate you spending time with us, and we have other videos that we think are great too. So please check those out as well. Thanks again, and see you soon.